Welcome to the Cedar Falls Committee of the Whole meeting. This May 20th, 2019. I'll now call this meeting to order. We have a couple of items for discussion this evening. One is the downtown parkade and streetscape, and then bills and payroll. So I believe we are starting with Ms. Sheets for the first item. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I have tonight Andy Meisman from Snyder & Associates who will co-present with me. He and I co-presented at the public meeting that we had, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I will kick things off. Slide here. So what we will go over tonight is just a little bit of background about the streetscape planning that has occurred to date, talk a little bit about existing conditions along the parkade, some of the information that went into the concepts that are before you tonight, and then the recommendation and next steps. So that's the plan for what we'll cover tonight. Just for background, many of the council members are probably pretty familiar with this project by now. We've talked about streetscaping at a couple council committee meetings back in July of 15 and then June of 2018. And what we were putting together was a project here that we ended up applying for a Black County gaming grant that we secured, and so we have moved into a contract for what that design would be, and moving then from this point, hoping to move into construction documents so that we could start a project next summer. So the streetscape implementation project that we have is kind of a two-phase project, and the overview of what's happening this year, as you saw, CFU's already been out along State Street working in that area, putting in conduit so that we can underground the electrical there, and then they'll be putting in foundations for lights and lighting probably later this year, probably late fall. Also, the same thing is expected along Washington to happen late fall, kind of really depending on schedules for summer construction at this point. And then we would come in, the city would then work to install, if you recall, we talked about a year ago about hub areas where we'd have a bench and a trash can and a bike rack with some decorative pavers around that. So the city would do that once CFU's completed their work so that we're not in each other's way. What we are preparing for here is moving forward with the parkade project. So tonight would be the first step as we're trying to then get to what the concept plan should be in terms of the pattern and the general color scheme. That's what we're looking for council feedback tonight on so that we can start working on construction plans for that project next year. And then we'll be moving into reconstruction, looking at reconstruction of 3rd Street and what do we do with the side streets there. Also streetscaping along 6th and along 2nd. So that's a little bit longer term plan, but just kind of going over all of that and where we're at to date. So in terms of existing conditions, many of you also are familiar, you've walked with the downtown, you've seen some of the deterioration that's happening, aging materials, a little bit of some areas where we're lacking some amenities, and just having some difficulty with some of the planter beds and that type of thing. So this is a little bit of why we're even looking at doing the project. What we moved into then was in working with Snyder in the contract that the council approved a couple months ago. We were looking at mainly the parkade area, but then the side streets, these cross streets that are highlighted in this image, was where the focus was of what that streetscape expansion could be, what those side streets might look like over time as we do construction projects in the downtown. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andy, who did a lot of the design work.
Stephanie said, my name is Andy Meisman. I'm a landscape architect with Snyder & Associates from the Madison office. Just a little background about myself. I'm actually from Cedar Falls. I graduated from Cedar Falls High School, so this is a really fun project for me to work on. As a landscape architect, you don't get too many chances to work on your hometown project, let alone in a downtown, and already a really good downtown, so this has been a really fun project for me. Some of the background conceptualization what we worked on. We approached the project from kind of 3 perspectives. We wanted to look at a simple concept of a peel and replace, so keeping what's there or updating what's there, but keeping the same aesthetics. I'll go into these a little bit more detail. A traditional and contemporary approach, and also more of just an exploratory approach. Let's have some fun with this space. Let's make it into something totally different. But how this began was we looked at literally thousands of images. You can see a few of them here, of successful streetscapes, urban plazas throughout the world. What they included were, the pavers, colors, site amenities, elements such as pianos in these spaces, curb details, fence details to protect vegetation, how much vegetation's there, some of the planter pots, bollards, crosswalks, and that last little snippet there was the actual existing or the previous construction plans for the parkade done a couple decades ago now. And we looked at all that and started planning on our first approach here, which was pretty straightforward, which was a peel and replace approach. So this pretty much means keeping the same patterns, the same aesthetics that are there, but using newer materials, enriching the colors a little bit more, simplifying some of the patterns. There's a lot of, you might not be able to see them now because they're very faded, but there's a lot of probably over-designed elements that kind of lead the eye to nowhere. So eliminating some of those and simplifying the pattern, enhancing some of the planter beds areas, updating those, replacing the soil, but generally keep it as is. So this was our first approach for the project. This is looking at the 100 block of Main Street here, so just one little snippet of the overall site. We also looked at more of a traditional and contemporary approach. That's a challenging thing for a landscape architect or a designer to do, to blend these two together, but I think we did a pretty successful job with this concept. That traditional approach would be this red brick paver up against the building, so more of that historical red color that you'd typically see in a downtown, and using more of a contemporary pattern along the road here with those grays and the whites, or not the whites, the grays and the blacks, and more defined lines to help separate this space out and kind of make it more of a use zones here. And also looked at that middle image, which is more of a contemporary precast concrete seed element, which also functions as a planting bed. So introducing more of those ideas to help breathe a little new fresh air into this space was a part of this approach. The third concept was a little bit more exploratory. And one thing, being from Cedar Falls, I kept thinking about was, where's the river in this concept and how can we kind of reach it? And how can we bring it into the downtown theoretically, not physically, we don't want to do that. But how can we bring that river theme into here? And one approach is just using the color palette of a river, these blues, and some of these earth tone colors that would represent water and land. Also, we looked at some of these site amenities in here, such as the first little snippet down there. It's kind of small, hard to see, but that's a planting bed and a custom seed element. From plan view, it looks very kind of amoebic shaped, but from an elevation or a section when you're approaching this, it would take on the shape of a canoe. So using these ideas and implementing them through spaces down here, we felt was an appropriate scheme for here. Also, that other image next to it is just a bobber sculpture park. So where can we introduce elements like that into this concept? But what we came to the conclusion was this traditional and contemporary approach achieved the most goals that we set out, which was, there's a really good historic component in downtown, and we wanted to keep that. And we also wanted to have a new, fresh look at this. So this is the recommendation that we fell on. And again, using concept 2, but refining it a little bit after some meetings with the city staff and how we can define this area more and make it a little bit crisper. We would use, again, that red brick paving pattern up against the buildings, which kind of complements the historic architecture, and using other pavers, so this tan paver, which would separate that from the gray paver, that helps to define use zones. So maybe that space up against the buildings becomes more of your restaurant outdoor seating, or somewhere where someone can pull a clothing rack out and sell articles of clothing, stuff like that. So helping define space through this concept was important for us. Again, looking at that space applied to the 100 scale, or to the 100 block here. Again, just clearly defining uses. We used a lot of long, simple lines here to kind of bring it up to more of a contemporary look. Those darker paver patterns aren't random. We started thinking about these planters and how we can start to emphasize some of the space that's there and to enhance it more. So that's what some of those darker paver patterns do. You can see they generally line up with significant elevation or trees that are there. And we kind of went back and scaled down the planter actual space, or the planting bed space here, because of maintenance concerns that we had, and felt it was a better approach to use more planter pots to help introduce some greenery to here. And you can still see we do have a contemporary bench in the middle there of the block on that previous image that we showed. So tying all those together with these colors we felt was pretty appropriate and was starting to accomplish our goals here. We also considered the side streets and how do we pull in these schemes into the side streets. Obviously, there's not as much space along the side streets, so it becomes a lesser degree of aesthetics that we're putting in here, but the side streets became a functionality design challenge too. You could see in this is just a stereotypical side street example here intersecting with Main Street. But there's a lot of conditions, they vary through these side streets with parking and alleys and curb cuts that present a lot of functionality and design challenges and pedestrian challenges and safety issues. So we introduced the idea of these curb bump outs here that would help in terms of pedestrian safety, where a person crossing that alley space can kind of step out into this bump out zone a little bit more, and someone driving from the alley to the side street would be able to see that person standing there. They also function for amenity space. You can put bike racks, planters, lights, those types of components into these bump outs, and they also function for snow storage in the winter. Got to put that snow somewhere, so that's a good place for it. They also work for all the turning radius of the larger semis that are going through these alley spaces, and works in terms of that. So what we've been doing lately right now is just looking at the general layout and the general color of these paving patterns and what we need to do. And that involves a lot of heavy lifting. I wasn't here for this, but our civil engineer was. But he did a good job of just laying out these quick pavers that we're considering right now. And how do they look when they're out there on the street? How do they look when they're wet? How do they look like, what do they look like in the shade and the sunlight? These are all components we're still weighing here. And what does it look like when we put the sand layer swept between them, a very narrow band of sand, but that plays a big role in terms of aesthetics. There's one more slide there. Skipping ahead there. There we go, yeah. So we wanted to look at this, just some of the general colors that we're looking at now and the general layout and how that would look rendered out. These aren't true colors, these are photos of the pavers, so you start to lose some of that richness and color of the actual paver, but this is the approach we're taking to our final selection in these colors and layout, and I think we're achieving our goal of creating this traditional and contemporary space all along Main Street, and I think it's really starting to come alive here. So that's where we're at right now, and I can turn it over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Andy.
Yep, thank you.
So I just wanted to share with council a little bit about the feedback that we've been seeking and what we've heard there. So myself and Carol Lilly presented this to the Community Main Street Board at their meeting in April. Carol's been an integral part of our team as we've been looking at different concepts and even helped lift a couple bricks since Andy wasn't here. That was last week. And then we had a public information meeting on May 7th where we did a similar presentation to what we're doing with the council tonight to get some public feedback on that, knowing that the parkade is something that's very visible to not only the businesses downtown, but to anybody, so we wanted to invite that comment. And so I've just briefly listed really what are the primary points that I've heard out of those meetings. We've had questions about, can we do it faster? Just want it to be done. We think that the maintenance is needed. We think we need this project as soon as possible. Also, a little bit of concern of, well, if you're going to do it in phases and that's going to take 3 years, what's going to be the mismatch of the pattern? But I guess that's part of the transition, and so we just need to see how the first part of the project goes and see if that's something that we can consider in the future. A little bit of concern about the number of planter pots that are shown on the recommended concept, which is something that can certainly be pulled back, maybe particularly on the side streets, to really think about whether, maybe it's cut in half, for example. So it's not eliminated, it's just reduced a little bit with the concern about maintenance of those, possibly. We had a comment at the public meeting about public art and what could we do along even the side streets with some public art. Could there be some options for narrow pieces of art, for example? That's not something that's currently in the plan, and that's always something that could, I think, come out later. We would, at this point, the parkade is basically planned to keep the art pads that are there. There would be no changes to those, and generally keep the pattern of where the benches are, bike racks, that type of thing, with maybe some minor tweaks to that, depending on locations and that type of thing. Obviously, we've heard a lot about the durability of pavers. We've heard a lot about, think we should be considering clay pavers, so that's kind of the direction that we are looking at this point, but are talking with manufacturers and getting more information, making sure that we've really talked through all of the points related to that. At the public meeting, a comment about entrances to the downtown and what would we do there. If you recall, this is then a couple years ago, back in 2016, I believe, when I presented the schematic downtown plan. We identified a number of gateway locations for the downtown, and this project is not proposing to do the gateway projects. Those would probably be something later that we look at. But I think maybe this comment is coming from, what about that tie across First Street, for example, in particular, with the improvements that we're planning to the Peter Melendi Park, with the river project, with the tie of crossing the river, should that crosswalk at West First Street, for example, be enhanced with this project? So that's the West First Street crossing, I guess. Then the last thing is, we heard after the public meeting that there might have been some discussion related to the side streets, maybe particularly Second and Third Street, but maybe any of them, related to doing full brick on the side streets. Right now, the concept, if you saw that, calls for concrete closer to the building, maybe about a 4 to 5 foot wide strip, and then a brick band along the back of the curb that would be about 2 to 3 feet wide. So that's a little bit about what we heard at the various meetings. In terms of next steps, pending discussion tonight, what we're really looking for is to have a motion, and that'll be my last slide, in terms of recommending the pattern and the general color scheme. We are vetting how exactly the colors work and whether there might be some minor modifications, but we need the overall concept to move forward so that we can move into developing construction plans so that we can bid a project for the parkade in particular. We'll be looking at doing that by the end of the year. We do have a couple other projects we're going to try to integrate the pattern into. I mentioned Peter Melendi Park and how there's some work happening there with landscaping, with the sculpture, because of having to move that during the levee project. So we're looking at how we can incorporate the side street pattern, for example, along the Main Street sidewalk or along the trail that goes kind of through the middle of that park and into the sculpture area. So we'd like to integrate it there if we can, and of course we're looking to try to get that park done by the end of June before Sturgis. And then the other thing that we're trying to take advantage of is we have a River Place who's continued to develop, and their building that I refer to as MU2 that's there along 2nd Street is getting very close to requesting occupancy for the upper floors, and has a couple permits to do the build out of the first floor commercial spaces. And so the first floor commercial spaces will need that sidewalk in place along 2nd Street in order to open. And we'd like to take advantage of the opportunity. They haven't put down the concrete yet that was part of the original plan. We've talked with them about incorporating this layout, and they've been very open to that and interested. So if we can hone in on tonight here, we can take advantage of that with that project. So that's what we're looking to do. So with that, I'll end with this motion to proceed with developing construction plans utilizing the option 2, which we're referring to as the traditional and contemporary option. I think I already noted we've worked pretty heavily with Community Main Street, and we'll continue to do that as we develop the plans and any tweaks that need to happen. But Carol is worth her weight in lifting those bricks for us.
Indeed. Thank you, Stephanie. There's a motion here, Council. My plan, since we are taking action this evening, is to have a motion and second any discussion Council wants to have, and then open up to the public as well. So if there's a motion to move forward.
So moved.
Second.
I hear a motion and a second. I will open it up to Council. Mr. Manfred.
Just one thing Director Sheet said, there was some discussion that evening with the public, and I guess I would second that about carrying the red brick design through to the side streets. I think it would kind of help carry the concept forward, especially since we're focusing on trying to redevelop those side streets. I think that could be really valuable. And I'd like to see that added to the design if there's support for it.
Is that a motion?
Is that a motion?
Sure.
So
I'll second that.
Motion and a second to amend a red brick through the side streets. Open that up for discussion.
Question on that. Can you explain for us some of the reasoning why they had in the plan the concrete versus the brick?
Sure, I can talk about it a little bit, but Andy might elaborate just a little bit better. We were looking to bring the pattern of the parkade into the side streets so you get a sense of district being further off of the parkade. But we also didn't want to detract from the primary being the parkade. So we wanted you to get that feel, yet not maybe the full feel. I don't know, Andy. Very good.
Anything further on the amendment to carry the red brick over the side streets? Mr. Miller?
Or is the motion to do that fully down the side streets? Because I believe it's already included somewhat. Is that where you're going, Tom?
Yeah, so basically, when you can see on the, it kind of comes around the corner by like 1 square, basically, I would say carry it through the side street there. So instead of those like 4-foot concrete sections, do the brick sections like you see on the parkade design.
Put the slide up for the side street area, and I might, if we put that up, I'll use the mouse.
See where it kind of comes around the corner by 1 degree.
But are you also talking here?
If I comment further on that, or Mark?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. Cruz.
We've talked about expanding walkability throughout the downtown area, and if we continue with the Main Street pattern throughout many of the streets, if not all of them, as they get developed over time, even going up to Overman Park, it gives the feel for people walking down the street to say, this is downtown. You just keep going with the same pattern anywhere that there would be a sidewalk area. I know it'll be probably a little more expensive, but the subgrade of this will be built for whatever the surface is. So it's just a matter of switching from concrete to pavers in some of these areas. That's how I would look at it.
Anyone further? Mr. Ryan?
It sounds like there might be a question out about whether that's something that council would want to do or want to push is where you talked about like the full feel, having downtown, that approach go outward instead of just focusing that on the main street. And so it sounds like we're in favor of having that not just be special just to Main Street, that parkade approach, but that we do try to, as much as cost enable, we allow that across the whole district. Is that how I'm hearing it?
We'll find out. I mean, that's, I think, the discussion. Mr. Cruz, Ms. DeBoer?
One other question was, what was it that the shop owners preferred? Did they prefer the red brick on the side streets, or did they prefer the concrete on the side streets?
I don't know that we really heard much feedback on that. We had in attendance at the public meeting, I would say somewhere around 20 people or so, maybe 5 or so property owners along the area. Others were just kind of general interest public that attended. And the full brick discussion came up kind of after we had after the presentation, after I took Q&A. That was some one-on-one discussion that happened. But I don't know, Carol Lilly is here tonight. I don't know that she might offer any comment on that if I put her on the spot, or?
Please.
She's pretty shy about this stuff.
We really have not had that discussion with the property owners on the side, for the side street piece. This kind of came up last minute. We were kind of looking at it from an approach of the cost aspect and what that would look like from a cost standpoint. So we did not have that discussion. It was not part of what we talked about at any of our meetings. So I'm sorry, I don't have more feedback for you.
Okay.
If I may, Mayor.
Yes, of course.
Community Main Streets looked at this plan and supported doing that in a partial way, I guess. As far as keeping that uniqueness on Main Street, is there an opinion there?
We did, but at that point, it wasn't even thought of as an alternative
Okay,
from a bigger discussion.
sure.
Anyone further from the
Yeah,
council? Frank?
And from my original understanding, this, what we're seeing tonight is far more than I thought, that I kind of expected in some respects. I think that city staff appreciating the cost. I think originally was talking really about minimizing any of the brick elements. So to see the theme, not totally, but the theme carried off to the side streets the way this is, I think makes a lot of sense. I guess to me, it'd be great to have the whole downtown look that way, but if it's outrageously more expensive, this is still an awfully good choice B, I think. So to me, the decision would be mostly, do we go the full Monty here, and how much is that going to cost versus what we see in front of us right now? I mean, do you know, and am I wrong about that, Stephanie, that when we were raising money for the streetscape, there was some talk about just redoing the sidewalks with concrete and not even those elements? And I like this. I wouldn't want to see it be any less than this, but the full thing would be, I would think, awfully expensive.
You're correct, and that's part of the reason. I mean, Stephanie touched on a good point of the your overall design and aesthetics and keeping it focused on Main Street. But a large part of that idea was cost
And maintenance.
In maintenance and keeping that focused on putting the money onto Main Street. But we haven't dove down into the details because, I mean, we're just kind of finalizing these pavers and what we're going to use here. But that's something we'll definitely look at in terms of how much of the pavers, how much that would change the cost. And keep in mind, this graphic's just a quarter of a side street on one side. So multiplying that over 5 different blocks, it starts to become a financial consideration.
Yeah, my other question kind of goes with the timing of it, but we also, I think, on tonight's council agenda, we're talking about a contract to rebuild the alleyway on First Street, and how does that connect with the construction on the redo of this on Second Street? Does that encourage us to move Second Street up on our calendar to do it in conjunction with whatever work's being done? Or is that not going to happen this summer yet?
That
Or next summer?
block of Second Street was reconstructed several years ago, so we don't plan to be reconstructing Second Street from Main to State. We would be looking at the next block to the west, possibly next year, kind of depending on timing of projects.
But as far as the sidewalk, I mean, because you're also talking about with Kittrell's property wanting to take advantage of that.
Yeah.
So that and the alleyway and the streetscape, doesn't it make sense that we do all of that at one time? You know what I'm saying?
So we've got a little bit of a break there because of the entrance to the parking lot, so that's kind of a nice divide for the part that Mark Kittrell would maybe do. We don't currently have anything in the alley plans for the crosswalk of the alley. However, as I mentioned with the alley plans last time, we included an alternative to do some colored concrete that might complement the color of the brick that gets chosen hopefully tonight. And we could look at that crosswalk if we needed to. It's just kind of what's coming first and the timing of the different projects as we try to move them forward. But then we could possibly then talk about that, I guess the remaining half block of sidewalk between Main and the alley. If full brick is done on the side streets, then maybe that needs to be incorporated into the parkade project so that we don't have an odd gap. If that's maybe what you were getting
You
at.
said it far better than I did. That's what I was trying to get at.
Anyone for Mr. Whelan?
We're looking at amending the motion, excuse me, to include the side streets, yet there's not very much cost data that tells us which way we should go on side streets. My question is, if we approve an amendment, does that mean that your committee will take a look and give us a cost comparison back of cement versus doing the same style of street we're doing on Main? Is that something that would be given to us so we could analyze it? I hear it's more costly. How much? Nobody knows.
We can certainly, I guess what we would be doing when we're moving into construction plans is we'd be able to better quantify each approach, because now we have survey, we know exactly what we're doing with the project, we'd be able to give some better estimates. I'm going to ask Andy, do you have any kind of general percentage increase that bricks are over concrete that you could share at this point? Okay.
I don't want to approve something tonight, and I'm all for including it unless we get good cost analysis so we can make a decision on which style we put in later on.
I think if council doesn't have any objection, at least as it relates to this amendment, that we can certainly direct staff to find 2 different
Right.
bids as they move forward the letting process.
That would be good.
Is that going to delay you at all, though, Director Sheets? I don't want to hold up the project.
Well, I guess what we would probably look to do with the River Place project, for example, is we might just continue to try to work with them and see how much brick we can do. We already have a little bit of some timing of their needs to what we have going on that we're still trying to work through. So that would be the only one that might be a little difficult to navigate if we don't exactly know the direction that we're going. But that particular area leads into the plaza, and the plaza's gonna have a higher level, so even a break where I talked about with the parking lot entrance, it probably wouldn't feel too odd that that is a step up to other side streets if that were the way that things fall.
Mr. Mayor?
Anyone further on the amendment? Yes, Mr. Cruz?
Can we separate out possibly the choice or the final decision on the colors and the side streets and approve what would be about 90% of this and keep the rest of that more general for further discussion? Because I think we're in agreement on doing something very close to what's been proposed. It's just the colors, a little bit on the side street. That's some way we can amend it to do that.
I think that would, and correct me if I'm wrong, Director Sheets, but I think that would certainly cause a delay, right? If we don't make a
Yeah,
decision
we'd be
at all.
looking, this evening, we would really appreciate a decision about the pattern and the general color scheme, and then we would, through the construction documents, get into the particulars about if a shade works based on the opinion of our landscape architect there.
So you're not saying we choose what red, yellows, and grays we're using. You're just saying we approve that pattern.
Right, what we
And then
had
the
up
colors
on
can be
the
decided.
screen about using the red close to the building, and generally that shade of red, that's what we're going to try to accomplish. Generally that shade of, this kind of a tan, goldish type of color, and then the combination of two shades of gray.
If I can continue, the feedback I've heard is that there's concern about the coloring that we're choosing will look dirty with gum and traffic, that particularly that yellow strip. Whether we get something that might be a darker color that blends in with traffic and everyday life.
Well, that's something when Andy mentioned how we were out last week with actual samples, with the color ideas that at this point are proposed, and we were looking at that. Shade, sunlight, wet, dry. We did have a discussion about how would gum and other waste look on the bricks. And I mean, the bricks will need to be cleaned from time to time, and that they currently are with the gum, so. And at this point, I believe a sealant is proposed, just like a sealant had been done in the past on the bricks, so that kind of helps mitigate that just a little bit too. It's not going to make it perfect, but.
Mr. Miller?
As far as the process goes from here, then, if this does get approved tonight, you take that and move towards construction documents and work to get numbers, final numbers on what this is going to take, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So then that kind of leads me to the maintenance side of it, I think, is something we've got to be cognizant of. Yeah, you don't really want to put Community Main Street up for one block under construction every year for the next 20 years or 40 years, too, as much as I think it's worth it. But that's a huge disruption, too, depending on how the pavers hold up versus the concrete or whatnot, too. So.
I didn't hear any objection earlier, but if we move forward to have staff go through with either the colored or the red brick all the way through the side streets, there's still an opportunity for council to decide at that juncture if it came back and it was really extraordinary difference there, that council could decide to stick with the concrete compared to the colored, the red
Yes.
brick all the way up. I'm assuming that would be the case process.
So approving subject to numbers, final numbers on the cost?
Well, again, I think we have sort of a gentleman and ladies agreement that we're going to look at carrying the brick to the side streets, but also look at the concrete as proposed and find out those differences once it's let out.
And then a fundraising or a source of money to pay for it?
Yeah. Anyone further on? Yes, Mr.
Yeah.
Williams.
I just have one last concern, that's durability if we're getting pavers. The pavers we have been there, what, 10, 12 years?
Longer.
More than that, 20.
Not that long?
15?
Yeah, I think about 15 years.
15 years?
I think it was 2004-ish.
Yeah. They haven't lasted as long as we anticipated they'd last when we put them down. And there were people that were concerned about that. Can we get whoever provides, if we go with pavers, can we get anybody to guarantee that they'll last a certain amount of time based on actual testing, which means they got some credible history behind them? And I know it can happen. We've got 18th Street, which is brick from the 30s, and that brick is still in the street and it's still working good because it doesn't absorb water. And if we have pavers that absorb water, they're going to last 20 years.
Details real quick about longevity and lifespan. We looked pretty closely at the concrete pavers. That's what's out there now. We looked at newer materials for those, and we also looked at the traditional clay-fired brick. And discussing with both reps, going through a lot of dialogue with both of them, their life expectancy is generally the same. It's around 20 years. That's about what's been out there right now. It's in terms of how it ages is the big difference between a clay-fired brick and a concrete paver that's out there right now. The concrete paver ones out there look faded right now. They're actually not faded. They're degrading from the top. The aggregate that's composed of those pavers is falling apart. It's crumbling. So it looks like it's faded when it's actually just deteriorating. The clay-fired brick's a natural component. It's integral color all the way through. So when it does age, it ages with time. Time is a designer for it. So you're talking about a 100-year-old street with bricks on it. It looks good because that's a natural material. Clay-fired pavers, they're going to chip, they're going to break, just like a concrete one would. They're actually a little bit more brittle. That's why they make chamfered edges on them. They have little spacers between them to accept grout between them. So all those components go into consideration in terms of the longevity of them. It's just a matter of how they age is the big component of it. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you.
Yep.
Is there any substance besides salt that works on these things seems to me that's
Shovel.
have a lot of impact on it.
Salt is the big component that's going to help expand the life of both a concrete paver and a brick paver is going to be the sealant that's placed on it. Sealant should probably be placed about every 2 to 5 years. In a commercial setting like this, probably 2 years. And those sealants come in a lot of different degrees and aesthetics. There's ones that look shiny and glossy. There's ones that are more matte color to retain that natural color of the paver. And you'd apply that to a concrete paver or a clay-fired paver. It'd be the same type of sealant that you're putting on there. And they generally have a recommendation for salt and what you're supposed to use on that, and that's in their specs. And if someone's using a really harsh salt chemical, it will destroy it. So that's a matter of everyone, abiding by the same rules that are set up.
Thanks.
Anyone further on the amendment? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. So we'll go back to the original motion, the construction plans option 2 as amended. Any further discussion on that from council?
Are there other things that we should be planning? I mean, we've had so much discussion about parking downtown, and I think we wouldn't have as many issues if we had better signage and that kind of thing. Are we going to have some sort of signage plan that goes with this? And is there timing for that? I mean, we've got all these things going on. It'd be nice if we could kind of do them together as opposed to the year after or whatever. Anyway, is there anything in this plan that includes signage?
Right now, the plan that's in front of you hasn't even attempted to think about the signage, but we've talked conceptually, internally about when we do this project, what poles are going back up and what signage that we need to deal with the wayfinding signage. So that is something that's kind of yet to come for more discussion and really kind of integrates with the parking as well.
I know we can't think of everything, but it's nice to do everything together when we can. Thanks.
Thank you. Anything further? Yes, Mr. Cruz?
Something that comes to mind, we figure out the cost to change and install, but then the ongoing maintenance into the future and keeping plants alive and the planters and that sort of thing. What sort of discussion was there on sprinkler systems built into the ground to water trees and plants and that sort of thing?
We didn't talk about integrating irrigation. We did talk about that there might be some key locations where we've had trouble with trees, for example, that perhaps we need to use a different system underneath that might help the trees survive better. So it's a fairly costly system, but it might be something then to think of in a couple key locations. So we've talked about that.
Or the type of tree possibly, as far as the root structure? How invasive?
Yeah, there are certain types of trees that work better in an urban area, but I think some of the issue has probably just been vandalism to the trees.
So then, going forward, or well, currently, we have volunteers taking care of this, almost exclusively, I understand. And
One of them's on council, I know that, Mr. Dara.
so,
Semi-retired.
if we incorporate a irrigation sprinkler system of some sort where we can, and
Currently, our volunteers water the hanging baskets and the sidewalk planter pots. We do occasionally water the in-ground garden plots, just depending on if we have some new plants and that kind of thing. But typically, we don't water the in-ground planters on a regular basis. It's just the container gardening is what we water. We have waterers that water every day. Typically, it takes between 2 and 3 hours. So from a volunteer aspect, it does. There is a lot of effort that's put in on from the volunteers to maintain and keep downtown looking beautiful, and we truly appreciate the time that they donate to help downtown look great.
so we will continue to have plenty of volunteers, do you think? I mean, that's hard to say.
Well,
I
we
guess.
do, but I'm not sure how irrigation in the pots, because the pots we take in and out every season, just from the snow removal side. So I don't,
I was thinking more of the planters, the trees.
the in-ground plant, yeah, the tree piece. I know that was one
They
of the
usually
things that we
survive
talked
once they're
about,
growing.
and was included, I think, in some of those plans. That was Stephanie mentioned too about the checking into the cost of that, so.
Okay.
Anything further from council? Mr. Miller?
We can open it up for the public?
Yep, just waiting for council to get done.
Yeah.
Anything further? I will open it up for anyone who wants to come comment on the motion and the second for option 2, which again is carrying the red brick to the side streets with also checking out the cost for just the concrete as a plan as well. Anyone here like to speak on this evening? Mr. Schilling?
Jim Schilling. I own property downtown. I like the concept of this. I personally have no time for pavers. You can color concrete. There's a lot of things you can do. Plain old concrete is the best thing for streets and sidewalks. If you want to use the pavers for accent, that's fine. But we see what we have now with all pavers. They're a mess. They will always be a mess until there's some type of technology that makes them a nice paver. But there are no good ones.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Anyone further? Hearing and seeing none, it's been motion and second accordingly for council. Any further questions or concerns? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you very much for the good discussion. Thanks to Andy and Stephanie and Carol as well. Item 2, is there a motion to allow bills and payroll?
So moved.
Second.
Motion second. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Motion carries. We will now wait till the top of the hour for our regular council meeting. Thank you.